So I'm going to hand over now to Oka and Annabel for the first of 3 conversations titled Crises.
Thank you so much, Susan, for introducing us. So thank you to all of you for attending. Annabel and I are really excited about sharing this conversation with all of you. Please feel free to formulate your questions as they arise. So we chose Crises Multiple as the title for this first episode, this first part of the series, because crises, they are multiple and intersecting. And we constantly are asking each other, who are we as people affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, affiliated with UAL, who are the myriad populations that are represented among the faculty, staff, and students at UAL and those affiliated with the university. What is actually going on, which is, I'm sure, a question that we're all asking on a daily basis and have been asking since the beginning of the pandemic. And what indeed is the quote-unquote new normal? What was, in fact, the old normal? And what are we looking towards in the future? Annabel and I are both disabled women of what we're choosing to call the majority world, which is a term that we prefer to encapsulate our heritages as opposed to Western ideas of very Eurocentric, very Anglocentric notion of what is actually the minority world. We're both disabled women of Indonesian heritage. Actually, our mums come from villages not far from each other. And both of us have been noticing that all this talk of the new normal, quote unquote, does not include our communities, dismisses and ignores our scholarship, does not cite us, does not cite the lineages of disability, justice, scholarship, and artistic work and community work around illness, around survival, around living in late stage capitalism and what to do when the world seems to be crumbling, does not let our communities lead when they should be leading, does not include us in any kind of conversation about whatever a new normal is, quote unquote, what the old normal was, what we will be looking towards, even though these communities, disabled communities, perhaps you might call them disabled communities of color, of the majority world, have accumulated so much wisdom from before the pandemic and through it. We are amazingly in a global pandemic of illness being sidelined as people who have dealt with illness throughout lifetimes, and that is quite remarkably, it's an overwhelming testament to the power of ableist, colonial, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy.
Wow, what an opener, Oka. I think you're really right, though. I'm thinking about the long history of campaigns and direct action just in the UK, in the context that I'm familiar with. You know, the context of austerity in the UK, 10 years of deliberate defunding of crucial health and social care services and the privatisation of those services. And thinking about how, you know, a lot of what's been deemed, quote unquote, non-urgent care and services have been withdrawn further since the onset of COVID. You know, we're in the context of the deaths of thousands of disabled people, you know, a genocide of disabled people in the UK. And COVID, you know, in this context is only really the most recent / efficient killing of disabled people globally and in the UK. You know, disabled people are approximately 11 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than non-disabled people.
That's disabled women, yeah.
You know, 11 times. I think of my years working in the social care sector and how that time really moved me along from a disability rights framework to a disability justice one, you know, thinking about how rights have become for me an inadequate framework to think about this. You know, rights are reserved for very select groups of disabled people, contingent on the charity of state decision makers that has been hugely absent for the last decade. You know, the violence of austerity in the last 10 years has taught me that the concept of personhood and entitlement to rights is still steeped in the eugenicist legacies of Enlightenment philosophy. And so when thinking about the current crisis and thinking about the huge amounts of work, labour, knowledge production that have been taking place amongst disabled people, and especially disabled people of colour, for me, disability justice starts to account more for the complexity of our lives and strives for liberation over survival.
That's really well said. And we'd just like to say that the term disability justice, which, as Annabel eloquently described, is preferable to us than disability rights, which is more a very neoliberal notion of personhoods and citizenship. Disability justice is a term coined by queer artist of color collective Sins Invalid from North America, even though they're very rarely cited, right, as the first progenitors of that term. As I wrote in a recent Art Monthly article entitled How to Make Art in a Pandemic, the idea of the art world as an inherent good needs to be held in the light of how the art world, quote unquote, particularly as we know it here in the UK, the fine arts world, benefits from capitalist, extractive, colonialist policies. And what I mean by that is that, as we all know, the financial flows that allow for the funding of arts schools, such as UAL, of the arts institutions that we work with in the UK, often come from very wealthy donors who have stakes in countries such as mine, Indonesia, which is also, part of Annabel's heritage, in operations, whether mining, palm oil plantations, other sources of deforestation and pollution, and general endangerment of people and disabling of people. So on the one hand, for instance, as I said in the article, you might have new accessibility measures that are funded in a UK arts institution by a donor who has derived that money from the disablement of people in Indonesia by polluting, deforestation, forcible land capture and removal, and all of this interconnectedness of the neoliberal capitalist framework is something that I think people don't think about enough when you're just speaking about a very nationalist UK border control defined parameter of this current crisis and where we go. Because when we speak about resetting or going back to normal, quote unquote, what people often speak about is the very capitalist practices and the very extractive practices that have exacerbated this crisis to begin with. Annabel mentioned these horrible statistics that reflect a real genocide of disabled people. In fact, I think there was a recent study that showed in the UK, out of the many thousands who have perished from COVID-19, about 2/3 were disabled people. And many of these disabled people come from communities that are already endangered to begin with, who perhaps, although they live in the UK, have roots, have family in places that are not in the UK, that are being endangered by people from within the UK. So the art world, quote unquote, has had a clear hand in perpetuating trauma and multiple crises. The art world as a nexus of capital and capital flows, and keeping it in certain places rather than directing it towards communities such as the ones Annabel's worked with that have really needed this funding for our health and for our survival. I often look at Jasbir Puar's book, The Right to Maim from 2017, to look at this interconnectedness of capital flows, including art schools, right, and arts institutions, and how they've contributed to just how many people are currently suffering, are currently becoming disabled, are currently not here with us, who have passed away because of this breaking down of the social safety net. And therefore, we as practitioners of the arts within the UK and as members of UK art schools have to acknowledge our complicity in endangering people not only in the UK, but around the world.
Thank you, Oka. We were really already in crisis, and who's been most impacted by these crises is global. I'm thinking, I really like how you've woven, I appreciate how you've woven art schools into this kind of interconnected flows globally. And I think as well about how that crisis exists within the art schools themselves that are situated in the UK. Thinking about crisis of racial harassment as written about in the report by the Equality and Human Rights Commission just last year. I'm going to put a link in the chat. I'm thinking about how since the onset of COVID-19 we've rapidly shifted into online teaching modes, and that I read the recent report by Inclusion London that pulled from the Office for National Statistics about how disabled people are disproportionately represented amongst internet non-users. And I think, if you imagine that 56% of all the people in the UK that don't use the internet are disabled, compared with 22% of the overall population is estimated to be disabled, that's more than doubly represented amongst people who don't use the internet. In this shift to online teaching, in this crisis, in this response to crisis, this reliance on the online, who gets left out of that? Who gets marginalised again? The same people that have not been allowed into the building prior to COVID-19, who we don't find at art schools, still find themselves marginalised in the online mode as much as in the physical mode. I'm thinking as well about, how much evidence has arisen about the disproportionate impact of ableist structures on Black disabled people in the UK, and about the intersectionality of disability. How Black Lives Matter is seen as a crisis that kind of operates in parallel to COVID, but actually is very much overlaid, and it's not a new crisis as well.
Yeah, you and I have both learned so much from the Black disabled activists and artists that we are in community with. Black Lives Matter has always been timely and urgent since it began in the early 2000s, early mid 2000s, and it is not a now moment. Recently Silver Press did this amazing series called Revolution is Not a One-Time Event, which I highly suggest you look up, because it is not just, and it's not just the death of George Floyd, contrary to many PR supported statements by arts institutions, right? It's so many deaths of Black people in the UK and in the US, including those endangered even more by COVID because of structural racism and institutional racism, including the Black artist and staff, student, faculty that consider themselves members of UAL, who have been clamoring at UAL and other art schools for racism to be addressed and abolition to be enacted for long, long before this COVID-19 crisis. We will send you links in the email following this event if you want to connect and help our Black colleagues in the movement, who should always be leading the movement, especially our Black disabled colleagues, whether in the States, in the UK, and elsewhere. What we're dealing with right now, as you said, Annabel, very rightly, Black Lives Matter and COVID-19, they're part of the same crises. They're part of the same traumatic multiple crises. The pandemic interconnects with multiple supremacisms and systems, multiple countries, multiple positionalities.
And when I think about that, this vast context, and how often crisis pushes us to think about the now, I'm having to ground myself and ask, who has been doing this work? I can speak to UAL in terms of the UAL lineages that I'm part of. GEMS, as mentioned by Susan in the intro, the Group for the Equality of Minority Staff, UAL's largest and longest standing staff network representing Black staff and staff of colour, was founded 21 years ago this year. So in 1999 was founded by Avril Horsford, sadly not with UAL anymore. I think about Shades of Noir, founded in 2009 by Isha Richards. I think about Dee Janeja, who single-handedly and voluntarily chaired UAL's Disabled and Neurodiverse Staff Network for more than a decade. I think about all of the campaigns by student unions, across the UK, actually, against the enforcement of borders and policing within universities. I think of Goldsmith's anti-racist action, ongoing since last year with the occupation of Deptford Town Hall. I think of the student occupations at UAL. I've only personally witnessed the one that took place at LCC. So yes, I think we should respond to the current moment, but let's not forget our lineages. You know, I think about Adrienne Marie Brown in her book Emergent Strategy, and how in the introduction to that book she writes an explicit lineage of how she got there, you know, on whose foundations she's now situated. So I think it's important to ask ourselves in the current crisis, whose sacrifices, labour and knowledges carved the path for us?
That's really brilliantly put. Thank you, all of us, for joining us for this first part. And I think Susan will introduce the break.